Kiran Krishnan is an absolute just game changer in the world of the microbiome, especially the gut. He has had a massive impact on my life, my family, and he is a wealth of knowledge. He's able to connect a lot of these topics that we talk about on the Sowing Prosperity podcast in a way that makes it relatable and understandable, and tying a lot of these pieces together. So in this conversation, it's the first of two parts where we really dive into mitochondria and the connection with bacteria. Kiran, thank you so much for taking the time to join. You have made a massive impact on my life, whether you realize that or not. My little boy being diagnosed with cancer in 2019, I just dove into what we could do and learn, and Dave Asprey had a massive impact on me early on. And you and Tina were one of the first introductions for me into the world of the microbiome and how important it is. So, we're going a few years into this, and now with the podcast, I've interviewed, 100 experts across the world, and I think everybody knows and respects you, which is really exciting. And, I'm getting peppered with different questions that they would like to know. And so sincerely, thank you. You are absolutely very, very well respected in the world of health. So thank you for joining.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you saying that. It's exactly why we do what we do, right? To try to make a difference, turn the dial a little bit, and empower people with information and knowledge so that they can really take care of themselves, right? At the end of the day, we are our own best advocates for health. We can't count on systems. We can't count on, our doctors and hospitals the way we used to think we could. Those are much more designed as places you go when you're sick. But how do you prevent yourself from getting sick, and how do you prevent yourself from losing resilience? And that's where this kind of information comes in. So thank you so much for doing what you do and having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
I love thank you. All right, well, let's dive into metabolism, because I think that the mitochondria and metabolism are so directly related to overall well-being and health. And so that can be a little bit confusing, because right out of the gate, we're told, with anybody that understands mitochondria, that it is, an extremely old bacteria that has some sort of a symbiotic relationship with our cells and produces energy, right? So can you lay that out a little bit for us as the fundamental comparison of mitochondria and bacteria, kind of the differences or similarities there?
Yeah, absolutely. So mitochondria is thought to be an ancient, what we call ancient pleiotropic bacteria. That doesn't, it's not that important what that actually means. What it's actually saying is that there was probably an archaea, which is a different kind of single cell organism, that at some point symbiotically consumed a ancient bacteria for mutualistic purposes, right? So the thinking is that the hypothesis, and it is really hard to prove this out because, of course, this happened billions of years ago. But the thinking is that you take these ancient bacteria that were formed, they're very simplistic. We live in a carbon-based and oxygen-rich environment. So these microbes learned how to produce energy by using oxygen as what we call the terminal electron acceptor, right? And I'll explain that in a second. So this very primitive, simple life form, this ancient bacteria, figured out how to use oxygen in the environment to create energy. And then archaea, which normally do photosynthesis and things like that, they require sunlight in order to do that. In times where they found themselves in areas where there's no sun exposure, so imagine they're in a cave, right? They're in a river and they flow into a cave. Now all of a sudden there's no sun. How are they going to create energy when they can't do photosynthesis? The likely idea is that within a given environment, organisms tend to coalesce and find a symbiotic or mutualistic relationship. This bacteria does not have a lot of protective mechanisms on its outside, and so it became a benefit to it to be part of the archaea, which was more robust, it had more protection, and then the archaea got energy from this bacteria because the bacteria would produce energy from the available oxygen in the environment, right? So that's one of the hypotheses. Now, of course, we at some point stemmed from a lot of this type of evolution, and our single cells, our eukaryotic cells, which are multicellular organisms, incorporated this combination of bacteria archaea into our systems as energy components, right? So our cells can only derive energy from the mitochondria, and the mitochondria uses oxygen to derive energy, right? This is why oxygen is critical for our health. Now, why people need to understand this, right? It's because every single organ system in your body, with the exception of your red blood cells, every single organ system in your body is made up of cells, and every one of those cells have mitochondria. And the mitochondria in those cells dictate whether or not those cells function properly. And one of the most important hallmarks of aging and disease is the disruption of the function of the mitochondria. Because if the mitochondria starts to shut down, the engines of the cell shut down, which means the cell ends up shutting down, and then eventually that organ starts to dysfunction, right? Now, why is it that they use oxygen? This is a simple and interesting thing for people to know. There's something called the electron transport chain within the mitochondria, right? And electrons are transported from section to section of the mitochondria. And every time the electron jumps from one section to the other, some more energy is kicked out. And that drives this pump that converts ADP, adenosine diphosphate, into the energy form that we can use, which is adenosine triphosphate, ATP. It is one of the most elegant, beautiful biological things you will ever see, right? It's an energy machine. It looks like a turbine, right? We could design a machine, or it would take thousands of engineers to design a machine so elegant. It's this beautiful microscopic machine that rotates, actually physically rotates, which you can see in an electron micrograph, and grabs ADP, kicks off ATP. Now you've got this energy currency that it's kicking off. And it's doing that with the power of electrons jumping from one region to the other and giving off their electrical energy. Now, the final thing that accepts the last electron as it jumps through the different sections is oxygen. Without oxygen, you cannot accept the electrons at the end and then reuse the system again. The system starts to fall apart, right? So the cells need oxygen badly in order for the mitochondria to work. So they need fuel that comes in. Fuel is glucose, essentially. So sugar or fat. So the cells can use fat as well. But the fat has to be converted to glucose before they can use it. And then the final thing that makes it all happen is oxygen. Right, so we need the input, and then we need the driver, which is oxygen, and then we get energy currency, which is ATP. Right. So, and one thing that's really important to note, when you're young and healthy, one of the reasons why a 5-year-old has boundless energy. Right. When my kids were 5, they would eat the tiniest amount, and you would think like they've got to be starving, right? Because they're like hardly focused on eating. They're eating tiny amounts, and then they're running around bouncing off the walls all day. That's because they have 100% functioning mitochondria, and their mitochondria are 100% efficient, meaning for every molecule of glucose coming in, they kick off something like 27 molecules of ATP. As you age, the mitochondria in your system start to get dysfunctional. They get exhausted, they break down. So now you have less functioning mitochondria, and the functioning mitochondria won't kick out 27 ATPs, it might kick out 20 ATPs out of every molecule.
Wonderful.
So that becomes a foundational part of aging.
That's what Doug Wallace would coin heteroplasmy, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yep.
Yes. Okay. So you went through. I love how you went there. So my understanding with mitochondria is that it's even more than just the ATP production. What it does is it produces water, it produces CO2, it produces
NAD, a bunch of
heat, light, right? Like the whole, when we're talking about the TCA cycle and then going back and forth, how it actually can spin 2 ways. And I think that is absolutely fascinating. But let's go into your your understanding of the way that you look at this kind of light input piece with the, say, the circadian cycle, or even throw in what you know and understand with biophotons, because I think that this is something that your world with, say, the quantum mechanics, quantum physics world come together, as you were explaining the ATPase with in there. So do you care to go into that a little bit more? Because I find it fascinating, and your perspective adds a whole nother layer.
Yeah, what really where it comes down to is this idea that there's bacterial or microbial communication that we don't understand at all, right? We don't quite understand how bacteria can communicate at a distance. And when I say at a distance, I mean even within our body, right? Between the gut and the lung microbiome, the microbes can communicate with each other. It's hard to understand what those chemical signatures are, how it happens so fast and instantaneously. They don't seem to be using our pipes and tubes for that communication, so our neurons or our vessels. They have a different innate way of communicating. Now, our cells have all learned about cellular communication from bacteria, right? Because bacteria were here before human cells. So they wrote the rules on how cells communicate. And so our cells tend to mimic how bacteria communicate. So if we're seeing anything in bacterial communication logic that doesn't quite make sense, that communication likely happens in human cells as well, right? So that's the premise behind it. Now, what are we seeing in the bacterial communication world that's super unique? Well, there's definitely chemical communication that can actually be measured. That's something called quorum sensing, right? So where you put a bunch of bacteria together, they grow in an environment, many of them will start spitting out chemical signatures of themselves that are indicative of them. And then other bacteria have the capability of reading those chemical signatures. So they can pick up and they can go, we know who's here and what concentration. Now, microbes will also talk to each other within their own species through those chemical communicators. So for example, take Listeria monocytogenes, which is an infectious bacteria. One of the things, and it's typically a foodborne illness, right? Now, one of the things that Listeria has figured out is that it's not a very strong pathogen, meaning in order for it to actually cause an infection, it has to reach a certain threshold concentration in the body. And if it doesn't reach that threshold concentration, its impact on the microbiome, immune system, and all that is not robust enough to cause an infection. So what Listeria does, let's say you get exposed to it from eating contaminated lettuce or something like that. It comes in, it goes, sits in your gut, and they start to multiply. They don't express any toxin genes. They try to go under the radar. They try to stay quiet, but they very quietly multiply, and they're constantly talking to each other to understand what their threshold or what their current concentration is. When they reach a certain threshold concentration, where they feel like they have strength in numbers, that's when they turn on all their virulence genes and start making their toxins and doing all that, right? So bacteria within species use that kind of chemical signature to communicate. Then there's other bacteria like Bacillus, for example, that can read those signatures and go, wait a minute, there's Listeria here trying to grow and trying to reach a critical mass. We're going to jump in and start killing them off, right? So they have that capability of doing that. Now, those are the chemical side of communication. Now, there's evidence that there are other mechanisms of communication. So electromagnetic, for example. We are electromagnetic beings, right? We have an electric field. We have a magnetic field as well. And our cells, we know, respond to electromagnetic stimuli. And we know that bacteria respond to electromagnetic stimuli. So they have ways of receiving electromagnetic signaling and then also potentially transmitting it as well. Right? We know that red light therapy, for example, is really powerful in terms of improving mitochondrial function, reducing oxidative stress, so reducing pro-oxidants within the cells itself. And we know that red light therapy can do that, whether you put it on the outside of the body or you can shine red light into the body or into a closed system with cells, and it has an impact. That is nothing but photons of light, right? And somehow photons of light have a communicative impact on cells, which means that cells have a way of receiving photons of light, even though they're not photosynthetic, right? And then those photons of light have a way of transmitting information into the cell to affect gene changes, right? So that indicates that there's likely a photonic communication between cells as well. We also know that sound waves have an impact on cells. We know that sound waves have an impact on bacteria. We know that different pitch and tones can have that. There have been researchers that have done studies where they use, really noxious sounds on things like plants or organisms versus very soothing sounds like classical music. And there's a difference in how they grow, right? And so we know that sound waves have an impact. And so I think that's where it starts to get super mysterious, because then this whole idea of quantum entanglement, right? And particles are entangled. We know that in the universe, right? They can be entangled across the universe and instantaneously affect one another faster than the speed of light. That happens in biology too. When you start looking at quantum biology, everything in your cell is made up eventually of atoms, subatomic particles, and then even smaller particles than that. So there has to be an impact of quantum mechanics in there as well. And there's some really interesting companies like Lila Quantum and all that are coming out with products that can seem to change the quantum field of products and have a different impact as a result of it. But it's super new. And a lot of it is theoretical just yet. But I think it's going to be a really fascinating area of study.
I love that. I love how well versed on such a wide range you are. I think that's probably why you're so endeared with my friends. Can you go into the effect of the circadian light cycle, right? Like the sleep wake, the sun, the dark, and the impact of how that can possibly have an impact inside, say, the intestines?
Yeah, that's a really, really important component, right? So it goes back to the theme that we were derived eventually from bacteria. Like our cells have lots of bacterial components to it, and our cells function much in the way that bacteria tend to function even today. And so there's lots of things that have been brought about from the way bacteria function. One of those things is life cycle. Right. So in a bacterial life, in a bacterial day, let's put it, there are different components of the bacteria's life cycle because, of course, you cannot express all your genes all at once. Right. You want to be absolutely efficient about gene expression because gene expression costs energy. And it's also a risk because every time you express gene, where you go from DNA to RNA to protein, there's a risk that mistakes happen in the coding, and the mistakes could lead to mutations, and the mutations could lead to dysfunction. And so biology tends to be very efficient and very precise. And so the thinking is that, well, it makes sense that you can't express and you don't want to express all genes at all times. You actually want to only express the most needed genes at any given time. Right. And so you reduce your risk of errors and you reduce the economic and the energy cost of doing so. So bacteria have developed that way. So if you're doing fermentation, for example, if I'm trying to grow bacteria in a big, vat, and this is a bacteria that, let's say, produces an enzyme. So take an enzyme tannase that breaks down tannic acid, or lipase that breaks down fat. I know the bacteria has a gene to do that. If I just grow the bacteria in general broth, it's probably going to produce that gene very little, right? It's going to express that gene very little. It's not expressing it all the time just because the gene is there. The way I get to get the bacteria to induce that gene is I start changing the fat content and the energy sources in that ferment, right? So now I take the ferment and I start reducing the protein and the sugars and I start increasing the fat. All of a sudden the bacteria will start expressing that gene a lot more. Now I can get the bacteria, if I want, to a point, and this is called directed evolution, where it deletes the protein metabolic genes or the sugar metabolic genes completely by only feeding it fat for a long period of time and creating stressors like heat stress or electromagnetic stress or pH stress. So what that then does is it selects for the bacteria that are the most robust at breaking down fat, using it for energy, and using it to repair itself, right? Because I'm putting stressors and I'm only giving it one source of fuel. And so what may happen then is you start getting mutations where bacteria that have left off those other genes that are not necessary start to become more prominent. This is called directed evolution, where I can drive the cell towards a certain outcome by changing the environment, right? Now, I explain all that to say that the environment matters a lot. What is happening in the environment dictates what genes are expressed and dictates what phase the cell is in. And that's the same thing with light and day, right? The reason why our system developed what we call a diurnal system, which is a 24-hour clock with 12-hour phases, because of that gene expression efficiency and because the environment changes quite dramatically from light to dark, right? And so our gene bank doesn't express certain things in the light cycle and doesn't express certain things in the dark cycle, right? So we've come to be evolved where we sleep during the night, which means that the cells have evolved to know that, okay, he's sleeping. We don't need all these metabolic genes being turned on, right? You're not getting up and running around and stuff. And so let's suppress those and let's turn on the housekeeping genes. And the housekeeping genes are really important. The reason they're really important is because those are the genes that express proteins that clean up all the damage that occurred throughout the day, right? Including damage to the mitochondria. So these are mitophagy genes or autophagy genes, which clean up and repair broken cells and broken DNA and debris that has occurred as a result of living throughout that day. There's also really important gene expressions like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is really important to repair the brain from all the damage that it experienced that day. So you wake up the next morning with the same brain that you went to bed with. If that gene is not expressed effectively at night, then you're not going to wake up with the brain you went to bed with. You will wake up with the brain that is slightly more damaged and less functional. And if that happens day to day to day to day, over time, you'll start to experience brain fog, slowing down of cognition, anxiety, all of these things that we experience quite readily in the Western world. A lot of that is due to continuous damage to the brain and a lack of repair at night because we're not respecting the importance of that circadian switch. Now, that circadian switch is also very impacted by the microbiome. The microbiome knows that you go into a circadian phase that is considered nighttime, even though the microbiome is not seeing light stimuli. It knows that by your feeding patterns, right? So this is where it becomes really important. This is one of the reasons why eating really late at night or in the middle of the night is really not good for you. Right? Because what happens is that in normal human behavior, think about 99.9% of our evolutionary time, we probably stopped eating when the sun went down, right? And the reason for that is it's too risky, too hard to be out there in the wilderness trying to get food when it's dark, right? There's a lot of nocturnal predators and all that. So humans generally, when it was dark, went into confined safety. And we didn't start storing food till just a couple thousand years ago. And so for the most part, we did not eat at nighttime once it went dark. So for us, the light is a stimuli to tell us, our brain, our cells and all that, okay, we're going into a new phase in our 24-hour cycle. What the gut bugs are looking for is a lack of food coming in. Once food has stopped coming in for a period of, say, 3-4 hours, all of these housekeeping microbes start to proliferate, right? And they're not really great at breaking down macromolecules. That's not their job. Their job is to start breaking down secondary and tertiary molecules that the primary digesters have created from breaking down the macromolecules in our dinner, for example. And then these guys will take those secondary, tertiary molecules and start converting them into things like urolithins to repair the mitochondria, short chain fatty acids to dampen all the inflammation and fix things that are broken in the lining of our gut and so on. And so it's very important for the microbes to make sure they're going into that maintenance, healthy repair phase. And that only happens if we stop eating and provide a period of fasting for the microbes. You don't have to fast 24 hours or anything. It's just that normally you should try to eat your last meal right around when the sun goes down, right? And then stop eating. Hopefully
Love
that
it.
makes
Love
sense.
it. It does. It makes a lot of sense. So, do you have any thoughts then on the concentrations of melanin within, say, the large intestine? What is that correlation between bacteria and melanin? Why would we have it deep inside of our digestive tract?
Yeah, so melanin is an amazing absorber of free radicals, right? So melanin can really neutralize free radical damage. And one of the realities of cellular, respiration, as we call it, so the cell's utilization of oxygen to make energy is called cellular respiration, right? But one of the byproducts of using oxygen is free radical generation, right? Superoxides. That's why we have this very important enzyme in our body called superoxide dismutase. That's a SOD as it's abbreviated. You can get it as a supplement. It's in certain foods and so on. The reason it even exists, or catalase, which is another one of those enzymes that are really important, is to quench the effect of the superoxides, right? And superoxides are like the exhaust from the metabolic process that the cells go to. It's no different than your car has an internal combustion engine, and the result of that combustion and the generation of energy is the exhaust comes out the other end, right? And the exhaust, if in high concentrations, can be harmful. And so the same thing with the superoxides. Think of it as a cellular exhaust, and it has to be quenched and neutralized. So melanin is one of those powerful things that can do that. That's one of the reasons why it can be so protective from UV radiation, because it can absorb a lot of the superoxide and oxidative damage that UV radiation does, right? So that's one of the key reasons. Now, there may be other things around photons, because melanin, of course, is a great absorber of photonic energy, right, from UV radiation, a broad spectrum of UV. And so maybe there is a emission of photons in the gut that we don't quite know about yet. We know, for example, in the depths of the ocean, right, when you get to the really, really deep, cold regions of the ocean, high pressure environments in the ocean, there's no sunlight coming in there at all because it's so deep, and the sun is refracted so many different ways by the time it reaches down there, that there are microbes that have photonic capabilities, right? They produce photons as a form of energy, and they can communicate with each other in that way. And so there could be microbes in the gut that produce photons as a result of energy metabolism, and then as a need for communication. And then other microbes may require melanin to absorb and receive those photons. So that's another potential reason for that. But I think the superoxide, the oxidative stress reason, is a very plausible thing, but it more than likely has multiple functions. It's just like, melatonin, for example, right? We always thought of it as just the sleep inducer, but now we know melatonin is used in so many parts of the body, including the gut, for motility and all kinds of other reasons, right? So one of the beauties of biology is the amazing utility that systems get out of just a few things. If you think about vitamins, right? There's something like 13 essential vitamins. But those 13 essential vitamins, if you combine them all together, catalyze hundreds of thousands of different reactions, right? They're so well utilized in such a broad spectrum. Not any one of those vitamins does just one thing, right? They do hundreds upon hundreds of things. So I think that's probably a couple of plausible explanations for melanin there.
Yeah. I love the comparison of the deep sea and then the gut. I think that's great. I'm going to ponder that a lot more. Thank you for joining us in the Sowing Prosperity mission. If you like this content, like and subscribe, share with your friends. Be sure to check out sowingprosperity.com. Sign up for the email. We've got so much more work to do.